The scent of garlic and sesame oil was the only thing in the house that felt honest. Nia stirred the bubbling doenjang jjigae, the rich, fermented soybean paste clouding the air with a comforting warmth that was a lie. Nothing else in the sprawling Gangnam mansion was warm. The marble floors were cold enough to ache through the soles of her shoes. The vast panes of glass overlooking Seoul were cold. The silence that hung in the air between the ticking of unseen clocks was the coldest thing of all. She had been here for 3 weeks, hired as a private cook for the elderly Mrs. Kwan, a woman with bird-like bones and eyes that held a galaxy of forgotten sorrows. The job description had been simple: create nourishing, traditional Korean meals. The interview, however, had not been. It had been conducted by the son, Kwon Jihan. Nia hadn't known who he was then. She just saw a man carved from shadows and discipline, his bespoke suit a darker gray than a storm cloud. He hadn't asked about her culinary school degree or her references. He had watched her, his gaze so heavy and analytical it felt like a physical weight on her skin. He'd asked one question: "Are you afraid of silence?" She had said no. It was the truth. She'd grown up in a house loud with laughter and argument, but she had always found peace in the quiet moments, in the hum of a refrigerator and the soft chop of a knife against wood. He had nodded once, a sharp, surgical motion. "You start Monday." Now, she understood the question. This house was a temple to silence. Its acolytes were the guards who stood like statues in the hallways, their faces blank, their dark suits identical. Its high priest was Kwon Jihan himself. He moved through his own home like a predator patrolling the edges of its territory, his footsteps making no sound on the polished floors. He was an absence that had a presence, a void that pulled all the light and noise into it. Nia added the tofu to the stew, the soft cubes sinking into the savory broth. Mrs. Kwan liked it soft. She liked her rice just a little sticky, her kimchi aged just so. Finding the quiet rhythms of the old woman's palate had been Nia's anchor in this strange, unsettling world. She cooked for the mother, but the son was always there. He ate what she made, his expression unreadable. He would sit at the enormous dining table alone, a plate of her food before him, a ghost at his own feast. He never complimented the food. He never complained. He simply consumed it, his focus absolute, as if fueling a machine. Tonight was different. The silence was frayed at the edges. Tense. Earlier, a man Nia had never seen before had arrived, his face slick with sweat. He was escorted into Jihan's study, and the heavy oak doors had closed with a sound like a vault ceiling. She plated the stew, the steam rising in a fragrant plume. She arranged the banchan, the small side dishes, on a lacquered tray: glistening spinach, spicy cucumber salad, braised black beans. It was a meal of comfort, of home. A stark contrast to the cold dread seeping from under the study door. As she carried the tray for Mrs. Kwan's dinner, she had to pass the study. The voices within were low, guttural. Korean, spoken too fast for her to grasp more than the tone. It was the sound of a blade being sharpened. Later, after she'd cleaned her kitchen until the stainless steel gleamed, she heard the study door open. She froze, her hand on the light switch. It was her one mistake. She should have just left, retreated to her small, sterile apartment in the staff wing. Instead, she listened. "You are certain?" Jihan's voice was low, stripped of all warmth. It was pure, distilled menace. He was seen at the docks, talking to the Osaka representative. The other man's voice trembled. "My own cousin. I never would have suspected." A long pause. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the vibration in her teeth. "Loyalty is not a garment you can change with the weather," Jihan said, and the quietness of his tone was more terrifying than a shout. "A debt has been incurred. See that it is paid. In full. I want his entire line erased. A message must be carved so deeply they feel it in their bones for a generation." "Yes, boss." "And Lee, the body is the message. Make sure it is delivered somewhere public. Somewhere his wife will find it." Nia felt the blood drain from her face. She backed away from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She bumped into a small decorative table in the hallway. A porcelain vase wobbled. For a horrifying second, it balanced on the edge, a perfect, suspended moment of impending disaster. Then, it crashed to the marble floor, shattering into 100 white pieces. The sound was a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The study door flew open. Kwon Ji-han stood there, framed in the doorway, a figure of absolute authority. The other man was gone, vanished as if he'd never been. Ji-han's eyes, dark and depthless, found her instantly. He took in the scene, her, frozen in terror, the white shards of porcelain scattered around her feet like fallen snow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw the click of a lock falling into place. She was no longer just the cook. She was a witness. She had heard the words that were never meant for the air, the sentencing of a man she'd never met. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and deliberate. He stopped just before the broken porcelain, his expensive leather shoes inches from the mess. He looked down at the shards, then back up at her face. His expression was unnervingly calm. "It seems," he said, his voice a soft, silken threat, "that you have a talent for being in the wrong place." She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. He took another step, crunching a piece of porcelain under his heel. The sound was obscenely loud. "My mother likes your cooking," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. It would be a shame to have to find a replacement. It wasn't a compliment. It was a cage. He was telling her, in his own cold, precise language, that she was now a part of the house, another possession to be managed. Her simple job had just become a life sentence. She had seen behind the mask, and he would never, ever let her go. The days that followed were a study in controlled paranoia. A guard, a stoic man named Min, was now posted at the end of the hallway leading to the kitchens. He was polite, his bows precise, but his eyes followed her everywhere. Her trips to the market for fresh ingredients were no longer solo affairs. She was driven by one of Ji-han's men, who waited silently by the car, his presence a constant, suffocating reminder of her new reality. She was a prisoner in a palace, her cage padded with the finest ingredients and the most advanced culinary appliances. Nia threw herself into her work, using the familiar rituals of cooking as a shield. The rhythmic chop of a scallion, the sizzle of oil in a hot pan, the patient stirring of a sauce, these were her acts of defiance. In her kitchen, she was in control. The mansion might belong to Kwon Ji-han, but this gleaming, stainless steel domain was hers. Ji-han's mother seemed to notice the change. The old woman had a quiet wisdom, an ability to see the things left unsaid. One afternoon, as Nia served her a simple pine nut porridge, Mrs. Kwon reached out and laid a fragile, paper-thin hand on her arm. "You have a good heart, my dear," she said in her soft, lilting Korean, which Nia was beginning to understand. "It is very loud." Nia looked at her, confused. "Lot, mang." Here, Mrs. Kwon touched her own chest. "A kind heart beats loudly in a quiet house. My Ji-han, his is too quiet now. It was not always so." Nia simply nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "He was going to be married once," the old woman continued, her eyes distant, lost in a memory. "Her name was Sohee. She was like sunshine. She made him laugh. A real laugh. From the belly, a shadow passed over her face. His rivals, they knew she was his only weakness. They did not come for him. They came for her. He was too late to stop it." She looked at Nia, her gaze sharp and clear. "He built these walls around himself after that. He thinks if he feels nothing, he cannot be hurt again. He is a fool. A heart that does not feel is a heart that is already dead." The story settled into Nia's bones, a piece of a puzzle she never wanted to solve. It didn't excuse the cold-blooded order she had overheard, but it explained the emptiness in his eyes. He wasn't a monster born of nothing. He was a man who had his heart carved out and had filled the void with ice and control. The danger that had been a whisper in the hall became a scream a week later. Nia was arranging vegetables she'd gotten from the market when the sound of squealing tires and a sickening crunch of metal echoed from beyond the compound's high walls. It was followed by a series of sharp, percussive cracks. Gunfire. Instinct took over. She dropped to the floor, her hands over her head, her body pressed against the cool metal of a low cabinet. The gunfire was sporadic, answered by a more disciplined volley from within the walls. The house guards were responding. The air vibrated with tension. After a few agonizing minutes, there was silence. She stayed on the floor, her breath coming in shallow pants. The kitchen door burst open. It was Jihan. He was moving faster than she'd ever seen him, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stark against the dim light. There was a dark, jagged tear on his left sleeve, and blood was seeping through the fine cotton. His eyes swept the room, checking every corner before they landed on her, huddled on the floor. For a split second, something flickered in his expression, not relief, exactly, but a raw, unguarded intensity. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to form words. He strode over to her, his presence filling the space. He didn't offer a hand, but he waited. It was a command. "Get up." She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling. He gave her a quick, clinical once-over, his gaze lingering on the dark gash on his own arm. This was her chance. In the chaos, she could have run, slipped out a back door, climbed a wall, screamed for help. The thought was a wild bird beating its wings inside her chest. But then she thought of Mrs. Kwan, alone in her room. She thought of the story the old woman had told her. She made a choice. Ignoring the tremor in her hands, she walked past him to the pantry. She came back with the small first aid kit she kept for kitchen cuts and burns. She said nothing. She simply opened it on the counter, taking out antiseptic wipes and a sterile bandage. He watched her, his body coiled like a spring. He hadn't asked for help. He probably hadn't received it without demanding it in years. "Give me your arm," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He hesitated for a heartbeat. It was the first time she had ever seen him uncertain. Then, slowly, he extended his arm, placing it on the steel counter. The wound was a deep graze, littered with small shards of what looked like glass from a car window. His blood was a shocking, vivid red against his pale skin. Her fingers were gentle as she cleaned the wound. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but she felt the muscles in his arm tense into stone beneath her touch. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the clean scent of antiseptic. They were so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. She focused on her task, her professionalism a fragile armor. When she was done, she wrapped the bandage firmly around his forearm. Her fingers brushed against his wrist, and their eyes met. The world seemed to fall away. There was no gunfire, no guards, no shattered vase. There was only the charged space between them, a silence that was not empty but filled with 1,000 unspoken things. His gaze was dark, intense, stripping away her defenses layer by layer. He was looking at her not as an employee, not as a witness, but as a woman. A woman who, in the midst of chaos, had not run from him, but had moved toward him. He pulled his arm back slowly. The contact was broken, but the current still lingered in the air. "Thank you," he said. The two words sounded foreign on his tongue, as if he hadn't spoken them in a decade. He turned and left without another word, leaving Nia alone in the humming silence of her kitchen, her heart beating a loud, dangerous rhythm against her ribs. The attack changed the atmosphere in the house from a cold war to a siege. The number of guards doubled. Jihan was a constant, restless presence, a storm contained within the walls of his home. And he began to seek her out. It was never direct. He would appear in the kitchen doorway late at night while she was prepping for the next day, leaning against the frame, watching her work. He never spoke, but his presence was a heavy weight. She would feel his eyes on her as she minced garlic or rolled out dough, a silent, intense scrutiny that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She told herself it was surveillance. He was making sure the witness didn't get any ideas. But she knew, deep down, that it was something else. One evening, he walked in while she was tasting a broth. He came to the counter and stood beside her, his proximity a deliberate breach of the space between employer and employee. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Yukajang," she replied, her focus on the simmering pot. "Spicy beef soup. Your mother said she was craving it." He picked up a clean spoon, dipped it into the pot, and brought it to his lips. He tasted it, his expression unreadable. He set the spoon down with a soft click. "More salt," was all he said, before turning and leaving. It was the first time he had ever commented on her food. It was not a compliment, but it was an interaction, an acknowledgement. It was a crack in the ice. The true test came a week later. Jihan informed her that the pantry was low on a specific type of premium rice vinegar that his mother preferred. It could only be found at one specialty market in Itaewon. It was a clear setup, a test of the perimeter. Min would drive her. 2 other guards would follow in a separate car. The market was crowded, a vibrant explosion of sounds and smells. For a moment, surrounded by the mundane energy of people shopping for their dinner, Nia felt almost normal. She found the vinegar quickly, her hand closing around the cool glass bottle. As she turned to head back to the entrance, a man bumped into her, hard. "My apologies," he said in English, his smile not reaching his eyes. Before she could respond, another man moved to block her path. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. These were not shoppers. They moved with a purpose that was entirely out of place. Suddenly, Min was there, his body shielding hers. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice dangerously calm. He spoke into his wrist. "Compromised. Market entrance." The 2 men fanned out, their intentions clear. They were trying to separate her from her guard. One of them reached for her. Nia reacted without thinking. She swung the heavy glass bottle of vinegar in a wide arc, smashing it against the side of the man's head. He staggered back with a cry of pain, his hand flying to his temple where blood now welled. The brief moment of chaos was all Min needed. He moved with brutal efficiency, a blur of motion that left one man on the ground and the other stumbling back into the arms of the 2 other guards who had just arrived. It was over in seconds. They bundled her into the car, tires squealing as they pulled away from the curb, leaving the scene behind. Back at the mansion, Jihan was waiting. He looked at her, his face a mask of cold fury. But the fury wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the world, at the enemy who had dared to touch what was his. He walked over to where Min stood with the captured attacker, who was now bound and gagged. Jihan didn't speak to the man. He simply looked at him, and the man began to tremble. Jihan gave a slight nod to his men, and they dragged the attacker away, his muffled cries echoing down the hall toward the basement. Nia knew what was about to happen. She had heard the sentence he'd passed on the other traitor. She should have been repulsed. She should have been terrified. And she was. But a strange, dark understanding bloomed in her chest. This brutality was the price of safety in his world. It was what kept the walls of this mansion standing. It was what had just saved her life. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of the equation. An hour later, Jihan emerged from the basement. His knuckles were raw, and there was a small, dark fleck of blood on his cheek. He walked directly to the kitchen, where she was standing, staring unseeingly out the window into the manicured garden. He stopped in front of her. She didn't flinch. She reached for a damp cloth from the sink, and with a steady hand, she wiped the blood from his cheek. It was an act of profound intimacy, an acceptance of the violence that clung to him like a second skin. She had crossed a line, and she knew she could never go back. He caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. His thumb stroked the delicate skin on the inside of her wrist. His eyes bored into hers, searching for something. "You weren't scared," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I was," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I was angrier." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his features. He let go of her wrist and walked to the glass doors that led to the garden. He stared out into the darkness for a long time. "In this house," he said, his back to her, "everything is a transaction. Loyalty is bought. Fear is currency. Silence is a weapon." He turned to face her, his expression raw, stripped of all its usual defenses. "Your quiet is different. It's the only thing in this house that isn't a lie." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. It was more powerful than a declaration of love. It was a confession. He was the king of an empire built on deception and violence, and she, the cook from another world, was his only truth. The enemy had tried to use her as a pawn to get to him. They had failed. They had only succeeded in showing him exactly what she meant to him. And now they would pay the price. The threat was no longer a shadow at the gates. It was a name. The Osaka clan, trying to muscle in on his territory, had made it personal. They sent their message not to Jihan but to her. A single, perfect white orchid was left on the seat of the car that took her to the market, discovered by a guard during a routine sweep. Tucked into its petals was a small, simple note. "The prettiest flowers are the easiest to cut." Jihan saw the note, and the color drained from his face, replaced by a glacial fury that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. He was a man who controlled everything, and the thought that his enemy had gotten close enough to leave a flower for her was an intolerable violation. He placed the mansion on absolute lockdown. No one in, no one out. The house became a pressure cooker. The guards were on edge, their politeness replaced with a grim, watchful tension. Nia continued her duties, her movements confined to the kitchen, Mrs. Kwan's rooms, and her own small apartment. The routine was the only thing keeping her sane. Jihan was a ghost, disappearing into his study for hours, his voice a low, angry murmur on calls that stretched late into the night. But he always found his way back to the kitchen. He would stand there, watching her, the silence between them a living thing. He was drawing something from her presence, a moment of peace in the storm he was preparing to unleash. The final confrontation came on a rainy Tuesday. A call came for Jihan, a demand from the Osaka clan's leader for a face-to-face meeting. A neutral location. No soldiers, just the principals. It was an obvious trap. "I have to go," Jihan told Min, his voice flat and resolute. "If I show fear, they have already won." Nia overheard them from the kitchen. Her blood ran cold. He was going to walk into an ambush. While the men strategized, their voices a low hum of tactical planning, an idea began to form in her mind. It was desperate. It was reckless. It was the only thing she could think of. She knew this house better than any of the guards. She knew its rhythms, its secrets. She knew about the old dumbwaiter shaft, sealed up decades ago, that ran from the basement pantry directly to a service closet behind the main study. She was smaller than the men. She could fit. While Jihan prepared to leave, a decoy for the real fight to come, Nia put her own plan into motion. She went to the kitchen, her movements calm and deliberate. She pulled out a large cast-iron skillet and a container of oil. She turned the gas burner on high. As Jihan's car pulled away from the front of the mansion, a signal for the Osaka clan's hidden assassins to make their move on the now supposedly undefended house, Nia poured the oil into the skillet. It began to heat, shimmering, then smoking. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and tipped the pan. Grease exploded onto the hot stove, and a pillar of flame shot toward the ceiling. The fire alarm shrieked, a deafening, piercing sound that shattered the mansion's tense silence. The sprinkler system kicked in, raining down water. It was the chaos she needed. The guards, thinking it was a real fire, were thrown into confusion. This was the diversion. Jihan's real plan, she now understood, was to draw the attackers in, to fight them on his own ground. Her fire was the signal he was waiting for, the trigger for his own men, hidden in the surrounding grounds, to close the net. Gunfire erupted outside, a symphony of violence. Nia didn't wait. She ran, soaking wet, to the basement pantry, pried open the old dumbwaiter door, and squeezed into the dusty, narrow shaft. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, toward the study. She emerged into the service closet just as two of the Osaka assassins, having bypassed the main security, broke into the study, expecting to find it empty. They were there for Jihan's records, his entire operation laid bare on his computer. Before they could react, she burst from the closet, screaming, wielding a heavy fire extinguisher. She sprayed one of the men directly in the face. He staggered back, blinded and choking. The other turned, his gun raising, but the momentary distraction had been enough. Min was there, a shadow in the doorway, his own weapon firing twice in quick succession. The two assassins fell. The fighting was over in minutes. Jihan's trap had worked perfectly, accelerated by her desperate gambit. When he returned, he found her in the silent, water-drenched kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, shivering. He walked directly to her, ignoring his men, ignoring the damage. He knelt in front of her, his suit soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He took her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. His eyes searched hers, filled with a terrifying, raw emotion she had never seen before. "They told me what you did," he said, his voice thick. She just looked at him, unable to speak. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the violent tremor that ran through his body. He was not the cold, untouchable boss anymore. He was just a man who had almost lost the one thing he could not bear to lose. A week later, the mansion was quiet again. The damage was repaired, the memory of the attack scrubbed clean. But nothing was the same. A cost had been paid. Jihan now bore a thin, white scar above his eyebrow, a permanent reminder of the fight. Two of his best men had been lost. Victory, in his world, was never without a price. Nia stood in her kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. The scent of ginger and chicken filled the air, a scent of healing, of home. Jihan entered, as he always did now.
He didn't speak.
He came and stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He simply held her, watching the soup bubble on the stove. Her life was no longer her own. She would never walk freely in a market again. The world outside these walls was a permanent danger. But here, in the arms of the most dangerous man in Seoul, she had found a strange and ferocious kind of peace. She leaned back against his chest, her hand covering his. She had made her choice. This was not a fairy tale. It was a kingdom, built on shadows and steel, and she was its queen.